for us to be able to capitalize on. And the topic that has basically been shared for the DG to present and talk on was to provide an overview of the opportunities that can lead to faster action on climate change and the need for deploying climate finance effectively. Some of the points that basically the DG had and was expecting to share with you all is regarding the investments that are required to be able to deploy climate action on both mitigation and adaptation and the resources possibly that are required to be able to deploy the action. About US dollars 100 billion is basically, has basically been talked about as an additional investment that India would require to meet its 2070 net zero target. India's short and long-term climate action targets will require deployment of large-scale finance from public and private sources through innovative financial instruments like green bonds, green loans, and blended finance. So the scale of resources that are required that we are basically talking about with regard to climate action are massive, and this massive agenda that we're talking about with regard to implementation cannot be taken forward without technology support, the right kind of technology support, but also financial support that can help deploy this technology on the ground. Solar energy remains the biggest player in the climate town, with large companies like Reliance, Adani, Renew, e-resources, etc., committed with billions of dollars through generating large ticket size in the form of renewable energy investment. $15 billion with a focus on adaptation, also with co-benefits on the mitigation side when we are talking about promoting climate smart agriculture and public and private partnerships with regard to leveraging action with regard to various interventions that can be taken forward in the agricultural sector. The recently announced budget highlights that the government's approval of rupees 19,774 crores are in the form of incentives to be deployed for green hydrogen in the Indian economy for low carbon development pathways. It's a massive investment that the government of India is basically making with regard to give a thrust to green hydrogen in the country. And we do hope that this reaps certain benefits over a period of time. India relies heavily on multilateral and bilateral sources of finance for climate action. However, the COP that we recently basically experienced, COP27 witnessed 193 parties coming forward with regard to a call for MDB reforms and introducing non-debt instruments taking into account debt burden among borrowing countries. The G20 presidency in India this year has a pivotal role in pushing the agenda of MDB reforms. In fact, there is a parallel track where they are discussing multilateral financial reforms including reforms with the purpose to support climate action will definitely be one of the areas that will be discussed. And of course, also a strong policy messaging which will come across from the G20. So we have Dr. Dhawan here. Do you want to? Okay. 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 So focus on deploying climate finance in develop. So So G20 presidency is also going to give a thrust to multilateral financial reforms, which would basically assist in the overall climate action process that we are talking about. Considering India's ambitious climate action targets along with development priorities, the magnitude of finance required is massive. Hence, the private sector players need to play a significant role. And we do know that the agenda that we have with us and we've put forward, with regard to the scale at which action is required on climate will not be possible if we do not have all stakeholders, playing their roles with regard to the implementation process, and the private sector entities play a very important role in the whole scheme of things that have to be taken forward. So definitely the role of the private sector in mobilizing large-scale finance and assisting in the transition pathways is crucial, and therefore, we do feel that they will have a large role to play in the context of India with regard to pushing certain agendas forward. India is putting its first sovereign green bond on the radar of some of its biggest domestic asset managers, including state-run insurers and pension funds, as well as foreign investors. And it has basically been seen that these will enhance monetary valuation of sustainability-oriented projects in the years to come. Lastly, basically, international finance through cooperation in the line of objectives of the Paris Agreement is a crucial instrument to mobilize additional finance for climate action targets in India. Developing countries like India and nations like India, while mitigation is a focus, I think adaptation remains to be an important priority, and long-term adaptation strategies are pivotal to reduce the nation's vulnerability to the risks related to climate change. We are looking at funding mechanisms and support internationally through the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. Overall, India's climate action targets have been dictated through its NDCs that it has submitted as part of the Paris Agreement, and we do hope that we as a country are able to provide our inputs with regard to the global footprint that we have with regard to the greenhouse gas emissions, to be able to contribute in whichever way that we can with regard to giving climate action a thrust globally, nationally, and regionally. So I would just close with that. And of course, I would invite Dr. Dhawan if she would have to want to share a few points before we close.
Yeah, Suruchi, first of all, thank you so much. And my apologies to all the panelists and everyone who is present over here for getting delayed. It's too many meetings back to back, and I think I'm not managing my time that well. Or maybe others are more interested in talking to me, so my sincere apologies. So I'll first of all like to thank Ms. Richa Sharma. In spite of, I should say, one can imagine the workload on all colleagues in MOEF. G20 is not a small thing, and environment is such a big issue today. So I'm sure for her to take out time is really, really, we are thankful to you, ma'am. I'll like to acknowledge presence of high commissioners. They all are great supporters of TERI. And I'll like to put on record, because just a little while ago, I was with the ambassador of the European Union in another function, His Excellency, Mr. Ugo Astuto, Mr. Alex Ellis, British High Commissioner, Mr. Andre, Ambassador of Brazil, and Krishnamurthy, Embassy of Indonesia. And Anna, of course, she's our partner for this particular event from IGSD. We are really, really grateful, Mr. Atul Bagai. Thank you so much, sir. We just called him, and I'm really, really impressed that within no time he accepted our invitation. So thank you very much, sir. But it goes, I'll put it this way, that this is a G20 event, and perhaps, or if I'm right, the first one to be organized, apart from T20 and others, the first event which we are organizing, and we are very excited. about it, and thanks to Udayveer, Zerine, and others who contributed for conducting this. But no program is successful unless and until you have the right participants. So in this particular event, the group is not very large. It's not numbers, but I'm sure it's the quality. And I do look forward to participation from all of you on this important topic. So I won't take more time, and I hand it over to Anna, perhaps? No? Okay. So moderate the session. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dawan. We are so excited that you were able to. Ms. Sharma has worked in the government of India at the state and national level. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking TERI for this opportunity to speak on India's climate leadership and the way forward. India's climate actions are indeed so significant. They span several key sectors of its economy, and its plans for the future also fairly expansive, and I think the allotted time that I have may not do justice. However, I hasten to reassure you that I will stay well within the allotted time.
We don't mind if you exceed that because we want to hear you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, India is indeed at the forefront of the global response to combat climate change. Its position is cemented by strong domestic actions spanning key sectors of the economy, as well as in fostering impactful and results-oriented international collaborations on the global platform. India is committed to pursuing low-carbon strategies for development and is actively pursuing them as per its national circumstances. India's leadership in climate action must be framed in its proper context. And that context has a couple of elements. The first is the international climate regime. Now, India has always been a responsible party as exemplified in its prompt ratification of the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change and then its subsequent protocols and agreements. While some countries did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol and some even exited the Paris Agreement briefly, India always recognized the science behind the climate crisis and remained steadfast in its resolve to contribute strongly to an effective global response. Now, prior to the Paris Agreement in 2015, it was not mandatory for India to take any specific climate targets. Despite there being no mandatory obligations for emission reductions in the pre-2020 period, India did take on a voluntary target of reducing the emissions intensity of its GDP by 20 to 25% over 2005 levels by 2020. India launched the National Action Plan for Climate Change with 8 national missions anchored in different ministries and departments in 2008-9. India already recognized the co-benefits between climate and development. Now, these missions included, among others, missions that were focused on mitigation, such as the National Solar Mission, missions that were focused on adaptation, such as the National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture, the National Water Mission, the Mission for Sustaining the Himalayan Ecosystem, and also missions focused on enhancing the strategic knowledge on climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, India did achieve its pre-2020 voluntary target by 2016, having achieved 24% reduction in emissions intensity of its GDP. The international climate regime also recognizes that climate actions have to be undertaken by parties in the context of sustainable development and eradication of poverty in accordance with the principles of equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, and national circumstances. Now we should also examine India's climate leadership within a scientific and historical context. Now, the impacts of global warming that we are experiencing today are a result of the historical accumulation of GHGs. Carbon dioxide, once emitted, remains in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Now, what is India's contribution to this historical accumulation of greenhouse gases? It's only about 4%, whereas we have 17% of the global population. India's per capita emissions are about a third of the global average even today. The IPCC AR6 working group reports mention the concept of the carbon budget. The total stock or total amount of emissions that can be emitted to keep the temperature rise within a specified limit with certain levels of probabilities. Now, the carbon budget for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees with a 50% chance is about 2,900 gigatons. A lion's share of this global carbon budget has been used up in the fossil-fueled industrialization of today's advanced economies. The IPCC R6 Working Group 3 report, it has a whole table which explains the emissions from 1850 onwards right up till 2019. Now, North America and Europe alone have contributed about 10 times more to the global cumulative emissions during this period, although they have only 13% of the global population. And India's current emissions are about 7% of the annual total. So India has little responsibility for having caused the problem, but it, as I mentioned, wants to be a large part of the solution. In terms of its current context, impacts of the changing climate are evident worldwide. Extreme heat, flooding, change in rainfall patterns, drought, and water stress are already impacting ending hunger and malnutrition, universal energy access, safe and clean drinking water and sanitation. Now we must also respond to the climate crisis, which is not of our making. Since neither climate finance nor technology transfer is forthcoming as envisaged under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, India is largely using its domestic resources to fund its climate actions. And obviously, unfortunately, we are not on track to remain within the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, which is well below 2 degrees Celsius, and we are even further away from achieving the stretch goal of the agreement, which is 1.5 degrees. Now, to summarize, the context within which the climate of action of India and its climate leadership should be evaluated are as follows. First, it has minimal historical responsibility and even current responsibility in terms of per capita emissions and fair share of the global carbon budget. India has significant energy needs for its development. Our annual primary energy consumption per capita is about 28.7 gigajoules, which is considerably lower than both developed and developing country peers. Increasing climate impacts, as I mentioned earlier, are threatening a reversal of our development gains. There is no means of implementation support from developed countries as envisaged in the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, and the world is not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. So how is India responding to the climate challenge despite a less than optimal performance of the global climate regime? India's climate policy is informed by its vision of inclusive growth for all-round social and economic development, eradication of poverty, and firm adherence to the foundational principles of the UNFCCC, rational utilization of the fair share of its global carbon budget, and climate-friendly lifestyles within the backdrop of deep-rooted cultural tradition of reverence for nature. Now, as I mentioned, India already put in place a strong framework for domestic climate action through its 8 national missions under the National Action Plan for Climate Change. India prepared ambitious climate targets under the Paris Agreement and submitted those in 2015-16. Those targets were about reduction in emissions intensity of its GDP, about creation of additional carbon sinks, and about installed non-fossil electric capacity. India launched policies and schemes to help achieve these climate targets, whether in the sector of energy, transportation, industry, agriculture, forestry, water, etc. India also set up a national adaptation fund for pilot adaptation projects spanning a range of climate vulnerable sectors in 2015. The National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change has implemented about 30 projects across 27 states and union territories. It has a funding of about 847 crores, and it covers several sectors, including urban, coastal, agriculture, water, so on and so forth. India updated its climate targets on the basis of the strong progress that it already made. For example, the non-fossil installed capacity target was achieved 9 years ahead of schedule in 2022 itself. Therefore, there was already ample opportunity for India to update its climate targets. So India updated its climate targets in 2022 and submitted them to the UNFCCC. India also updated its national missions under the UNFCCC because now those missions would have to assist in achieving the enhanced targets. India also included new national missions such as on climate change and health, and it is already developing additional national missions, for example, on sustainable transport. India took a target of net zero by 2070. The global target is to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions from sources and removals by sinks sometime by the middle of the century. Now, clearly, those countries that have a larger historical responsibility and those that have used up a disproportionate share of the global carbon budget need to achieve net zero before 2050, so that those countries on a rising emissions trajectory have a longer time. And therefore, India has taken a target of achieving net zero by 2070, which is a fair and significant contribution to the global net zero efforts by 2050. India has also launched Mission Life to unleash the power of individual and community actions to achieve our climate and sustainability goals. India has also fostered international cooperation for global climate targets, such as through the launch of the International Solar Alliance, which already has about 112 signatories today, and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Agriculture, which has about 31 signatories, including 14 from the G20 and the European Union and 4 international organizations. India has also stepped up its South-South cooperation significantly, especially in CIA. For instance, the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States is an initiative that was launched at COP26. India has significant strengths in climate information services and early warning systems. India is working with small island economies through the UN system as part of information sharing and knowledge exchange on climate change. In short, our effort has been to shape an effective, cooperative, and equitable global architecture based on climate justice and principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. India continues to show leadership in terms of our ambitious domestic actions, our principled positions in international negotiations, and through our global efforts to help other developing countries in combating climate change. Now, in terms of our key achievements, I would like to mention some of them. For non-fossil fuel-based energy capacity, globally, India stands 4th in terms of installed renewable energy capacity, 4th in terms of wind installed capacity, and 5th in terms of solar installed capacity. India's installed renewable energy capacity has increased 396% in the last 8.5 years, and it stands at more than 174.53 gigawatts, including large hydro, which is about 42.5% of the country's total capacity as on February 2023. India saw the highest year-on-year growth in renewable energy additions of 9.83% in 2022. India's installed solar energy capacity has increased by 24.4 times in the last 9 years and stands at 63.3 gigawatt as of February 2023. To facilitate domestic manufacturing, Government of India has introduced the production-linked incentive scheme in high-efficiency solar PV modules for enhancing India's manufacturing capabilities and enhancing exports. The government has notified wind-solar hybrid policy, providing a framework for promotion of large grid-connected wind-solar photovoltaic hybrid projects for optimal and efficient utilization of transmission infrastructure and land, reducing the variability in renewable power generation and achieving better grid stability. The world's largest renewable energy park of 30 gigawatt capacity solar wind hybrid project is under installation in Gujarat. Wind energy has an offshore target of 30 gigawatt by 2030 with 3 potential sites identified. The cabinet has already approved the intra-state transmission system green energy corridor phase 2 with a total estimated cost of 12,031 crore. Honorable Prime Minister of India had announced the National Hydrogen Mission for generating hydrogen from green energy sources. The mission aims to aid the government in meeting climate targets and making India a green hydrogen hub. Government of India has also notified green hydrogen, green ammonia policy, which will help in meeting the target of production of 5 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030 and related development of renewable energy capacity. It is a major policy enabler for production of green hydrogen, green ammonia using renewable sources of energy. In terms of as I mentioned that I have a long list, and if I were to continue honestly, sectors like transport, energy efficiency, renewable energy, non-fossil energy, in terms of actions in hard-to-abate sectors, it would be a very significant list. In fact, I invite all of you to kindly look at India's long-term low emissions development strategy that was submitted to the UNFCCC last November, that already explains India's current policies spanning all of these sectors, but also its vision for the way forward. So what I'm trying to do now is basically summarize the current policies and achievements, and also what India intends to do in the long term to ensure that all its key sectors of the economy are already on a low carbon transition pathway. I'd like to briefly mention here that the government has also approved the final sovereign green bonds framework of India, which will strengthen India's commitments towards its NDC targets. Now, as I mentioned earlier, climate finance and technology transfer is hardly forthcoming. The proceeds that will be generated from the issuance of the sovereign green bonds will be deployed in public sector projects which help in reducing the carbon intensity of the economy. With regard to carbon markets and carbon trading, I'd like to share that the Parliament has passed the Energy Conservation Amendment Bill of 2022 to promoting energy efficiency and conservation. The bill empowers the Centre to specify a carbon credit trading scheme and stipulates that designated consumers may be required to meet a proportion of their energy needs from non-fossil sources. Phasing down of hydrofluorocarbons, India will complete its phase down of the HFCs in 4 steps from 2032 onwards, with a cumulative reduction of 85% of production and consumption of HFCs in 2047. The hydrofluorocarbons phase down is expected to prevent emissions of up to 105 million tons CO2 equivalent and helping to avoid up to 0.5 degrees of global temperature rise by 2100 while continuing to protect the ozone layer. Now, I will leave it at that without mentioning the actions that we have undertaken in the forestry sector, where already the area under forest and tree cover in the country stands at 24.62% of the total geographical area. We have several initiatives in sustainable transport, and the headline initiative in that is the Government of India's resolution to meet the target of 20% ethanol blending in petrol by 2025, which was earlier to be achieved by 2030. So if you look at all the key sectors of India's economy, whether they deal with you will find that mitigation and adaptation already stand mainstreamed in its development pathway. In terms of the way forward, I would like to just very briefly end by mentioning what India plans to do, for instance, in a couple of key sectors. For the low carbon development of electric systems consistent with development, India intends to expand renewables and grid strengthening, explore and support other low carbon technologies, focus on demand side management, rationally utilize its fossil fuel resources with due regard to energy security, and determine the green taxonomy and optimum energy mix which would complement national development scenarios. For an integrated, efficient, and inclusive low-carbon transport system, India intends to move towards a phased transition to cleaner fuels, a modal shift towards public and less polluting modes of transport, electrification across multiple modes, demand-side management, traffic management and intelligent transport systems, and of course, encouraging improved fuel efficiency. India also intends to promote adaptation in urban design, energy and material efficiency in buildings, and sustainable urbanization. This it intends to do by mainstreaming adaptation measures in the built environment and urban systems, promote resource efficiency within urban planning guidelines, policies, and bylaws, promote climate responsive, resilient building design, construction, and operation in existing and future buildings in the urban systems, and promote low carbon municipal service delivery through resource efficiency, management of water, solid, and liquid waste. Similarly, India intends to take several measures to promote economy-wide decoupling of growth from emissions and development of an efficient, innovative, low-emission industrial system. India also intends to explore CO2 removal and related engineering solutions. It intends to enhance forest and vegetation cover consistent with socio-economic and ecological considerations. As I mentioned, I have a long list of what India has already achieved, what it intends to do. But all of it is geared towards ensuring that India makes a significant contribution to the reduction of emissions. It plays an important role in fostering international cooperation on climate change, and that it remains a significant part of the global transition to and is for green growth. If you just look at the union budget announcements of 2023-24 that was tabled in Parliament on 1st of February, you would see the enormous push for green growth that is evident in the budget of this year and also in the last year, frankly. So with this, I think I will end my remarks. I invite everybody to kindly take a look at the India Climate Change Knowledge Portal, as well as India's long-term low emissions growth strategy that it has submitted to the UNFCCC as an example, to get more details about what India's plans are and what it has achieved. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Many thanks to Ms. Sharma for casting light on the ambitious program of work underway by the government of India that demonstrates India's continued leadership on climate change domestically and internationally. Thank you very much, Ms. Sharma. It is truly an honor to be here today and join you all for this important event hosted by TERI and IGSD, which is an official event under the Indian presidency of the G20 process. Among all the issues that the G20 is taking on, climate change is by far among the most challenging as it cuts across all sectors of societies and economies, posing one of the greatest risks to global and sustainable development. My name is Ana Maria Klemeyer. I will be your moderator for today. I'm an international climate and atmospheric law and policy specialist, and I've been invited by the hosts to moderate this illustrious panel. It is truly an honor to be here. We look forward to learning and being inspired by the words of our panelists. I ask each panelist to please try to limit their comments to approximately 7 minutes. They may hear a gentle reminder, a small tone, which is just a little encouragement to perhaps draw to the end of their remarks. Certainly, the countries that we have represented and institution we have represented today have all a wealth of experience and information to share with us, and they will be giving us highlights today, and I know that we all would like to meet them and join for the reception afterwards. So without further ado, it is a pleasure for me to introduce our first panelist, His Excellency Mr. André Correa do Lago, the Ambassador of Brazil. Ambassador Correa do Lago is a distinguished diplomat as well as a globally recognized architecture critic and writer. Between 2011 and 2013, Ambassador Correa do Lago served as Brazil's chief negotiator for climate change and sustainable development, including in the Rio+20 UN conference, which launched the Sustainable Development Goals. As a firm believer myself in the power of art to transform the world, I would also note that Ambassador Correa do Lago served as a member of the Architecture and Design Committee of the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, New York. He will, and I believe I'm not spoiling the news, but he will be leaving his current post to become the Secretary for Climate, Energy, and Environment at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in Brasilia. So we are really lucky to have him here today. Ambassador, How does the new administration in Brazil intend to transform Brazil's global engagement on climate change? And how do you envision using the G20 forum to build collective action?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for TERI and IGSD for inviting me today. I'm very glad that you asked me this because, as most of you know, there was a very important change in Brazilian policy and politics in recent months. And President Lula, when he was president-elect, went to Sharm el-Sheikh before he became officially president, but he committed to very ambitious changes in the not only environmental dimension of our efforts, but also in what you were mentioning of the decoupling between growth and emissions. So Brazil, now in the context of the G20, I think it's very interesting, first of all, that we can be all together and dear friends here to discuss the G20 that is now a group that has put together something like 10 developing countries and 10 developed countries, but responsible probably for 70% of the world's emissions to discuss climate change. But as my predecessor, dear Richard, has mentioned, obviously the climate change negotiations are under the UNFCCC and follow a logic of the UNFCCC. But I have to say that in view of my future functions, since I'm going to be the chief negotiator, I have to say that I understand very well, from one part, the frustration, be of the press or the general public, regarding some of the progress in those negotiations. I defend enormously these negotiations because I always remind that when we signed the agreement in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 for creating the Climate Change Convention, even The Economist, which is my favorite magazine, was saying that it was too early to have an agreement on climate change because climate change was something that was still abstract. So we have to give the credit to the United Nations and to the countries to have agreed on something at a time where information was much more limited. So UNFCCC has been extraordinary in promoting the information about climate change, the information of the options, and the right of the countries not only to understand what was happening, because we all had to learn about it, but also to promote solutions. And I believe that there are extraordinary successes in the UNFCCC. So first, that dimension. On the other side, in view of the frustration, because we all received the news from the IPCC and all these very frightening perspectives. I also understand efforts like we have seen in Glasgow, for instance, under the UK presidency, of trying to have like-minded countries on specific subjects that worry them or in which they are particularly responsible, to try to make an effort that is out of the let's say, of the necessity of a consensus of 193 countries. But this, I believe, is always welcome if it reinforces the UNFCCC, which I think is the intention. Brazil has a very unique situation in the G20, is that because of some policies that were, I think, definitely wrong, deforestation increased in Brazil significantly in recent years. And Brazil is the only large developing country that has more than 50% of its emissions related to deforestation. So the optimists, among which I am, think that if we succeed, as President Lula has committed, to stop illegal deforestation completely by 2027, and significant progress before, we are going to reduce our emissions incredibly, like it happened, by the way, in 2005, after 2005, when we committed to reduce our emissions. And by the way, High Commissioner Alex Ellis was ambassador of the UK to Brazil, so he knows that very well. He was there at that time. And we succeeded to reduce enormously these emissions from deforestation. And when you reduce the emissions from deforestation, you discover another Brazil, which is the Brazil that has some of the lowest emissions from energy of all the G20. So what I think we'll have to do in the G20 is to share the experiences and show that things are possible, because sometimes things look very far away and very difficult to achieve. But in fact, things are possible. And between India and Brazil, we have an example that I want to highlight, which is our common cooperation on biofuels. Biofuels is an experience that, depending on the country, can be extraordinarily positive. In the case of Brazil and India, we have the luck to be the two largest producers of sugarcane. And sugarcane biofuels have already the performance, according to the Americans, of advanced biofuels and almost second-generation biofuels. India is looking very much towards second-generation biofuels, because in second-generation biofuels you can use waste from basically any agricultural crop. But sugarcane biofuels are already extraordinary reducers, not only of emissions, because a flex fuel car that uses only ethanol reduces the emissions more than 60%. But more than that, ethanol doesn't pollute, so the quality of the air of the cities is absolutely extraordinary. So at the same time, you achieve a reduction of emission and you achieve a reduction of pollution. For many years, people would put the two things together, but in fact, they are different. But in that case, it works for both. And I want to mention that I'm very happy that as we saw together when we were at the India Energy Week, Minister Hardeep Puri has announced that under the G20, he's going to launch the Global Biofuel Alliance, which starts with Brazil, India, and the United States. So this is a very, very interesting a case in which we can have in the G20 developing and developed countries working towards strengthening solutions that, according to the country, can be extraordinary solutions. I think I got 7 minutes. Thank you for your patience.
Under 7 minutes, so you get a prize. I'll have to think of what it is. Our next distinguished speaker is His Excellency Mr. Alex Ellis, British High Commissioner to India. Over his career, the Commissioner has served as Director General in the Department for Exiting the EU and as Deputy National Security Advisor for the Integrated Review on Foreign and Security Policy. He started his civil service career as part of the team supporting the transition to multi-party democracy in South Africa following the release of Nelson Mandela, and has since had numerous diplomatic roles globally throughout his career. As a great admirer of educators and musicians, I'd also like to highlight that Commissioner Ellis has been a teacher, including in India, and he is a singer and sports enthusiast. Commissioner, how might the UK and India collaborate to increase ambition, catalyze finance, and accelerate action to close the emissions gap at the G20?
Thank you very much. Is that working? Yes, it is. So I'm going to contribute. I'll be a net contributor to the speaking budget in this event by trying to do it in 6 minutes and a 15% offer to. I can trade it, perhaps, with one of the people to my left in the best traditions of the UNFCCC. So the good news is that, and I really want to pick up something which Andrea said, The good news for us all is that the UN started dealing with this in 1992. If the UN was dealing with this in 2022, it would have no hope whatsoever of agreeing anything. So it's an extraordinary thing that actually you got the structures in place at that time in 92 and then again through the Kyoto Protocol, and a great achievement. Secondly, when you sort of think about the problem, I think my favorite film of last year, which was Everything Everywhere All at Once. That's kind of what you've got to do with this problem, because you can't just be doing it in one place or another. It's an extraordinarily comprehensive solution you need to find to what you're doing. And it's really about the speed of change and the management of, because no policy is ever pure, management between affordability, security, and sustainability. And we'll always say, oh, no, all three are perfectly compatible, but they're not sometimes, and you have to be able to deal with those tensions and develop the policies where you've had a big pull towards sustainability, obviously, in the last few years. But no politician is ever going to lose sight of affordability, I would say. So what I would say in answer to reply to your question, Anna-Maria, is you can do a lot. Money is something, and I'm looking at my colleague Sally here. I think we would recognize that quite a lot of our money goes into climate change in India and around the world, probably more than anything else, I would guess, around the world. Not quite, but an awful lot. And number one, money can come in lots of different ways. It comes in grant aid, but it also comes through investment in funds, which the British taxpayer does with India, and that's a co-production where we create funds together and invest, for example, in companies which can deal with bagasse, for example. You can do it through guarantees, as we've done with the World Bank. You could do it through direct participation by the British taxpayer in Indian companies, which we do as well through direct investment, including, for example, in Mahindra's new electric vehicles. You can do lots of kinds of money besides just the grants. But you can do a lot of other things. I'm just going to throw a few out there just to kind of get a bit of ripple in the audience. You could not invade Ukraine. And that's not a joke, because look what that's doing to energy policy in Europe and what it's doing to security. The reason that Germany's going for coal is because Russia's invaded Ukraine. Yeah, that's a big deal. It has a big impact on that balance between security, stability, security, affordability, and sustainability. And it pulls you a bit away from sustainability, I'm afraid. You can use a lot of your different instruments. I won't steal the thunder, but procurement is really interesting. Procurement, you could do an awful lot on procurement in any country to make it more green. You can do a lot on trade. It's very tempting as you're developing your electric vehicle industry to say that you're going to have really tough rules and not agree anything in a free trade agreement, for example, on electric vehicles, on really tough rules of origins. But actually, that is one of the ways in which you can create a more effective green economy, is through more liberal trade in some ways. You can create institutions, which is a like civil servant way of dealing with any problem. But actually, it's interesting what India has done through the International Solar Alliance and then through the CDRI, Resilient Infrastructure. You can actually find different forms of structured cooperation which will support what you're trying to do. You can do a lot of regional cooperation. I'm not going to try and make Ugo either hit me or laugh at me by referring to regional cooperation in Europe. But nevertheless, we actually have a very integrated energy market, particularly on electricity, and that includes the UK, which creates a great deal more opportunity for sustainability. And India is really interesting to see how India goes about that over the next few years through Sri Lanka, through Bangladesh, with Nepal. Some of that exists already. Can you grow that as well? So there's actually a lot of different things you can do. Finally, there are some tricky bits. I mean, some really tricky bits. I referred already to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that's doing to the security desire in countries. I think it is having a big impact there, actually. You have agricultural reform. That is part of how you're going to deal with the big leaps forward in climate change. And that is very hard in any country. It's hard in India. It's very, very hard in India. It's hard in any country. So it's not to be underestimated. Lifestyle change, very hard in my country, for example. The government tells people how to change their lifestyle. People will naturally react. They are changing their lifestyles. Our emissions are now about more than 40% less than what they were in 1990. Big decoupling of growth and emissions. But it's pretty tough when you go for lifestyle change. But that would work in India, for example, politically. It's interesting to see Prime Minister Modi using that. Housing, for example, in the UK, domestic, that's really tricky thing to do. So each country will have a specific sectors, and there's a lot of politics in this. One thing which I finally, and I think I'm going to stay within the budget, I think with 27 seconds left, is until now in the UK, and I suspect in quite a lot of developed countries, elections have not been fought between one party saying we need to do this and the other party saying we don't. And I wonder if that's going to happen or not. It hasn't happened in the UK. I don't think it'll happen in the UK. But that is the politics of this. It's so retail that you kind of have to deal with some of those most difficult issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Quite punctual, as we would expect, and we appreciate that. So our next third panelist is Her Excellency Ina Krishnamurthy, the ambassador to India and Bhutan. Prior to her posting as ambassador, during her distinguished career, she served as advisor to the Minister on Economic Diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, ambassador to the United Nations in New York, and director of ASEAN's economic cooperation, among many other distinguished national and international roles. And I'd like to point out that I just learned today that she is the first female ambassador of Indonesia. We hope that she paves the way and lights the way for many other female ambassadors to come. Ambassador, how might Indonesia leverage key global partnerships, such as the G20 and ASEAN or others, to increase ambition for near-term climate solutions?
For sure, I will not speak 6 minutes like High Commissioner Alex, but for sure, I would like to remind High Commissioner Alex that regional cooperation also includes ASEAN, not only EU. Anyways,
Could have saved yourself 20 seconds.
So I would like to start by thanking TERI and IGSD for inviting me and talking about Indonesia and ASEAN in our efforts to thrive against the most pressing issues facing our planet today. And this year, if you may know, together with India, we're the Troika presidency of G20, and as well, Indonesia is the chair of ASEAN. And I would like to take for what High Commissioner Alex Ellis said about different things of approach. Maybe I mention few of approach that we have done in Indonesia and as well as ASEAN. Indonesia is the biggest archipelagic country in the world, and we are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And that is why we fully understand the urgency of the issue. And in September 2022, we have submitted the Enhanced National Determined Contribution, NDC, and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 31% in 2030 with our own capacity and up to 43% with international support. And to reach this target, like India, also we have very ambitious and progressive policies, including expansion of nature conservation and restoration, implementation of carbon tax, volume netting of 2030, and as well development of electric vehicle ecosystem. And you may know we have one of the biggest in the world for the raw materials to make batteries. And to ensure the financing of energy transition, Indonesia has launched the country platform for energy transition mechanism. And during our G20 presidency last year, we continue the push for green recovery as well as strong and inclusive climate action. And this will surely continue on as we, as the chair of ASEAN, our theme for our presidency, our chairmanship is ASEAN Matters, epicentrum of growth. And we will continue on, put forward issues of climate actions and sustainable economic growth in its priority. Let me mention about ASEAN. ASEAN region is one of the most prone regions to climate change. It has suffered great fatalities and economic losses because of climate-related disasters. It is for this reason, beside the the climate change that we talk about. Regarding disasters, we have many initiatives under ASEAN for the climate actions related to disasters. Like for example, ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management, one ASEAN, one response. Like I mentioned, we are the biggest archipelagic state in the world, and we are quote-unquote supermarket of disasters in Indonesia. So we are very prone to high level rising of sea and oceans, as well as the drought. Now we are experiencing a very strange climate. Even during February, we have still a rainy season up to 100% every day. Every single day we have rain. And the flood vis-a-vis in the same part, the similar part, drought at the same time in one island called Java, it happens. So we are prone, very prone to disasters in that regard. And as a member of ASEAN, High Commissioner Alex mentioned about this, about the financial and technical support. As member of ASEAN, Indonesia is benefiting from the organization because the organization itself consists of 10 countries. We are voicing and advocating the voice of stronger climate action at the international level. And at COP27 in UAE last year, we also released a joint statement on climate change. And in the joint statement, we underscore the importance of COP26, and we want to boost financial support for climate action in developing countries, and the urge developed countries to fulfill urgently the commitment to provide 100 billion US dollars per year for developing countries, and to increase climate finance beyond this objective before 2025. I think I would like to close by saying what already underlined by Ambassador Andre from Brazil, that understanding climate change mitigation and adaptation is a game changer, especially developing countries. Developing countries should not do this alone. Already mentioned by Her Excellency Richard Sharma, and we need the support of our developed partners to achieve the targets, especially three approach: financing for climate action, investment for energy transition, the establishment of an effective and equitable carbon market. And Indonesia believes that we must be part of the solution. Every country must contribute in accordance with their respective capacities, with the spirit of burden sharing instead of burden shifting, according to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And I think there is no point of blaming each other, let alone create conflicts. So quoting the statement of my president at the COP26, and I quote, "There is no value in becoming a winner in a sinking world," unquote. So once again, I would like to thank TERI and IGSD for this initiative.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing those important perspectives. You're all making my job very easy because you're speaking within and even below the allotted time. So I thank you for that. Our next panelist is His Excellency Mr. Ugo Astuto, Ambassador of the European Union to India and Bhutan. Ambassador Astuto has many years of experience as a diplomat and working in international affairs. He has returned to India in his current role, having previously served as Deputy Head of Mission from 2008 to 2012. Prior to taking his role as ambassador, he also served as Principal Director for Asia in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Rome. His distinguished career includes postings in Nairobi, London, and Brussels. And he also served as the director for Italy to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I unfortunately don't have a humanizing piece of information to share as with others because I didn't have the chance to speak with Ambassador Astuto before, but I encourage you all to get to know him afterwards in the reception, as I hope to as well. Ambassador, what is the role of the EU in encouraging global cooperation to accelerate emissions reductions in this decisive decade for climate action?
Thank you very much. Yes, no particular human touch. I can say I've got 2 cats. Is that sufficient? Okay.
Beautiful, thank you.
Well, it's hard to follow my very learned colleagues, but still, let me try to give you the perspective from the European Union. And let me start with a positive fact, which is that we all start here in this room from the same proposition, which is that climate change is an existential challenge, that we need to act, and we need to act fast. Now it's an accepted proposition, but until very recently it wasn't. So that's certainly a mark of progress. Starting from that, what shall we do? Well, the action needs to be consistent and cohesive. It needs to start on national level, and then to be agreed and fostered at international level. So let me start by saying what we are trying to do domestically as European Union. Well, and here we have a policy initiative which is called Green Deal. And the Green Deal is a change of paradigm of the very social and economic features of Europe. So far, all too often, we have achieved growth at the expense of the environment. Well, with the Green Deal, what we want to do is to achieve growth, jobs, in an inclusive fashion, and through the protection of the environment. We have set ourselves very ambitious targets in terms of emission reduction. We were the first, as you probably know, to set a target for carbon neutrality, which is 2050. And even more importantly, we have set a target, a roadmap to achieve this target. That's what we call Fit by 55, which means that by 2030, we want to reduce by at least 55% our greenhouse gas emissions. It's an ambitious target, which brings together all of the 27, and which obviously implies a number of policy initiatives. And Alex has indicated some of the sectors we all need to work upon. It's a multifaceted endeavor. Let me mention here also the Russian invasion and give you a slightly different perspective. The Russian invasion has actually accelerated our transition. We are going faster into a greener energy mix that we had originally foreseen. And we have already reduced our energy consumption by 15% on average within the 27. Some member states more, others less, but the average is 15%. So the return to coal in Germany is very temporary and does in no way affect our target, specifically the Fit for 55 target. So one of the unintended consequences of the unjustified and unprovoked aggression by Russia is that we are going to accelerate our green transition. The era of Russian fossil fuels in Europe is over. That's the domestic side. Let me talk about the international endeavor, since I think we all agree that we need to work together. COP27, as President von der Leyen said, has treated the symptoms, but has not cured the fever. I think a fair assessment of COP27 is that in terms of mitigation, the action has been insufficient. I think we all need to focus on the action and mitigation in the coming months because if the current patterns continues, we are not going to achieve the target set in Paris. That is to say, an increase in global warming not beyond 1.5 degrees. And that would already be very serious, as we all know. So on mitigation, the very least we can say is not an entirely positive outcome. On adaptation, we have had a positive result, which is the adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund. Here I'm glad to say that the European Union has been instrumental in finding an agreement at COP27. When the positions were very far apart, we have played the role that we love to play, which is the role of bridging distant positions. And I think we helped in achieving a positive results in terms of the setting up of the fund. And as Ambassador Krishnamurti said, we are also convinced in the European Union that developing countries cannot address on their own this existential challenge of climate change. We take very seriously this engagement, and that's why the European Union as a bloc is the first provider of development aid worldwide. It's 46% of the total. And we are the first provider of climate funds. In 2020, it was about 20 billion, and it's increasing. The G20, what can the G20 do? Well, I think it can help in focus the minds further in injecting new momentum in this collective mission we do have to leave a word to the next generation which is fit for purpose, in the sense that if the global warming goes beyond 1.5, we know that catastrophic consequences are to be expected. So we need to work together, and failure to do so would be dramatic for all of us. And I'm happy to acknowledge here the role played by India. Also as G20 presidency, the setting of a target for carbon neutrality for India is an important model that we hope will be followed by many. The investment in solar power is massive, also very important. The creation of international platforms such as International Solar Alliance and CDRI, I think, are also a useful contribution to the global endeavor. And here, let me point out that the European Union is contributing to the fund mentioned by our colleague Richard Sharma for small island developing states. Well, we all know that small island developing states are the front line of climate change. So we welcome the initiative of CDRI, and we will contribute directly to that with 5 million euros. Between the EU and India, there is a very active climate cooperation, which has been progressing over the years. And I think that's a good example that we shall continue to follow in the near future, and to set also for others. We have a very ambitious program, working together on solar, working together on wind, working on green hydrogen, which is often seen as the next horizon when it comes to a greener energy mix. And let me conclude here by saying that, once again, that the challenge is global and the response must be collective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And thank you also for staying within the time limit. Our next panelist and guest is Mr. Atul Bagai. He is the head of the United Nations Environment here in India. Mr. Atul Bagai currently serves as the country office head for UNEP and has worked for UNEP for over 20 years, first in the Ozone Action Program under the Montreal Protocol, one of the greatest environmental treaties to ever exist in terms of its effectiveness in implementing its goals. He's also been instrumental in designing, developing, and implementing strategies that phase out ozone-depleting substances and mitigate climate change across South Asia. Previously, he served in the government of India for 17 years, including as chief of staff to 2 ministers at the federal level. Thank you, Mr. Bagai, for joining us, and also for bringing in an international organization perspective. Please share with us, how is UNEP India supporting India's capacity to reduce vulnerabilities and build resilience to climate impacts, including specifically to heat stress?
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to IGSD and TERI for giving me this opportunity to share this platform with 4 excellencies, 2 from the developed world and 2 from the developing world. And indeed, when the 4 excellencies were speaking, one could gauge the positions of both the stakeholders at an international level. And as UNEP, I'll come to UNEP India a little later, but as UNEP, I certainly would like to highlight that one of our main jobs is to bring the science on the table. And the science is so very clear. And as all the my co-panelists said, that time is of essence. I also wanted to highlight what Her Excellency from Indonesia mentioned, that one of the most basic principles of environmental governance is common but differentiated responsibilities. And at an international level, are we following that principle is something that UNEP likes to highlight whenever negotiations take place. And I think that's where both the stakeholders, the developing and the developed world, need to really look at, while the developing world is looking at meeting the commitments, are they lagging behind? Are they not going in for a higher ambition? And the developed countries need to look if they are putting, as part of the common but differentiated responsibilities, the money on the table. And that's one of the big challenges that the whole negotiations are facing. As the moderator introduced me as having been part of the Montreal Protocol for 22 years, and which is certainly the most successful international agreement, it's certainly not, in terms of challenges, it's a minuscule part of the climate change challenge that the whole world is facing. But I think Montreal Protocol gives us a very good model and an example in terms of how we can use that model for climate change. And that model is a model of reaching consensus come what may. And I think we need to look at that from a perspective of climate change. Richa actually put down such a long list of the actions that Indian government is taking, and I agree with her. She could have gone on for another 3 hours and she wouldn't have been able to complete, because there's so much happening in India on climate change. But I wanted to ask, how much of it is being funded by the $100 billion that has to come on the table? Meaning I would like that an analysis is done, and it's not just a question of India, it's a question of all the developing worlds. How much of domestic action is being funded by the money that has to come on the table for climate change? And one will realize that so much effort is being made by developing countries, despite the fact that development and environment need to coexist, but the development also has to take place. And I think that is the underlying theme which we need to look at whenever we are looking at what developing countries can do. As far as UNEP India is concerned, certainly, meaning what we are trying to focus on in India is to see how policy can be the vehicle for taking forward the resilience part of climate change, or even the mitigation part of climate change. And Excellency from UK mentioned the public procurement aspects are very, very important. So we're working closely with the Ministry of Finance to see that sustainable public procurement becomes a policy which can trigger so much of change in bringing in greener products. And as is known all over the world, that public procurement almost covers major part of the GDP in all the countries. So that's an important policy aspect we are working on. You're talking of heat stress as one of the areas where you want to find out how we can address. And that is an area which I think all organizations need to come together, considering what we have gone through over the last 3-4 years. I did my first posting in the government in a place called Jhansi in 1983 and 84. And in those years, it used to be 50 degrees in the summers. And do we want Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai to face that kind of a heat temperatures of 50 degrees? And it was a backward district. It wasn't an industrialized district. It wasn't a city as a metropolis. And yet, it was difficult to adapt to living in those conditions. I just can't imagine if Mumbai or Delhi having 50 degrees or 55 can even cope up with the kind of problems that heat waves will bring in. So there is some good work happening. NRDC, for example, has done a heat action plan for Ahmedabad, along with some of the partners. The government of India certainly is looking at replicating some of that work for all the cities in India. But then there are almost 4,000 cities in India. So how does that get scaled up? Where does the money come in from? So I think our role also is to highlight these challenges, and financing, as all the four co-panelists said, financing is certainly the key to whatever resilience or whatever mitigation efforts we need to bring in. And I think sustainable finance needs to be strengthened at all levels, and that's a very big contribution that the developed world can make to the developing countries in terms of sustainable finance rules. I'll only conclude that Richa mentioned a very good program that India has launched at a global level, LIFE. This is something that should have come from some other developed countries in terms of sustainable consumption and production. But anyway, India has taken the lead and wants to make it a global program. And I think one key difference that can be brought in is that we need to look at India's cultural traditions of Atithi Devo Bhav, which is also the G20 kind of a principle, that God, the guest is like a god, and you can see it in any hospitality you go through. I would only like to add that we need to bring in another principle of Prakriti Devo Bhav, that nature is God. And I think if that mindset can come in, we would be able to address most of the climate change issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bagai, for leaving us with those eloquent thoughts, also inspiring us with the philosophy that will light our paths forward. We have some time for questions from the audience for our distinguished guests. They may need to, if you could please keep the question short so that we have time to get to a few different people. Yes, sir, in the front. Here. Oh, thank you.
The question is addressed to His Excellency from EU. We're delighted to hear that because of Ukraine, the energy transition is likely to move faster. So is there any probability or opinion that 2050 net zero be brought forward to 2040 or something like that?
Yes, please.
Well,
Yes.
what I can tell you is that the 50 for 55 program already envisaged a very ambitious target, which is being increased. What I can tell you is that due to the Russian aggression and our progressively phasing out oil and gas from Russia, we have a clear increase in renewable energy, in investment in renewable energy. That we have increased our cooperation within the European Union in terms of connectivity, which also helps in terms of energy saving. Alex was referring to the connectivity in the European Union, which is already fairly advanced, but we are advancing further. So the short answer is that as an intended consequence of the Russian aggression, we are indeed working together for a faster transition towards a greener energy mix.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Yes, the young lady in the center.
Good evening, everyone. I am Zainabi, a 19-year-old climate action advocate from Delhi, India. I'm more than honored to be here, to be a youth voice here, and I'm more optimistic than ever after listening to all the esteemed panelists that we will be able to get through this crisis. But when we talk about climate change, climate finance always remain an important issue. And talking about the $100 billion goal, which has been promised by the developed countries to the developing world. However, this promise has not been paid attention to in the manner it should have been. And while we are making new negotiations and new decisions, while not paying attention to the existing ones, my question to all the esteemed panelists is, what efforts should be made and how G20 summit can play a larger role in accelerating as well as the achievement of the 100 billion goal? Thank you.
Thank you. And I turn to our distinguished panelists. Is there anyone who would like to take on the question? Feels.
I would suggest that we go in this order simply. And the point, I mean, I feel comfortable in answering. I think that's a very good question. But the fact is that the European Union has been walking the talk. As I said earlier, the European Union as a group, institution, and 27 member states is the largest provider of development aid worldwide, up to 46% of the total, and the largest provider of climate aid specifically. So I think I cannot agree more. Yes, indeed, we need to take seriously our responsibilities vis-à-vis the most vulnerable countries, particularly in the south of the world. And we also need to see how best to provide these resources, not just in terms of public money. Public money, even if we increase substantially, will never be sufficient. So we also need to leverage private capital. We also probably need to rethink what international financial institutions are doing, in the sense that the climate emergency must become the priority number one in terms of the challenge to address. So I think we need to take a holistic approach to finance and look at public finance, indeed, but also consider how best to leverage private capital and to have a sustainable approach to the provision of finance in order to progress towards a greener economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Is there another one of our distinguished guests would like to also attend to the question? Thank you.
So it's so nice to see the UK agreeing with the European Union. This is a very touching moment. But anyway, what I think your question is very appropriate, and I think the answer of Hugo is absolutely correct. And there is no doubt that the European Union has been a leader in finding ways of fulfilling this commitment that was made at the convention. And it's very important that you remind that this is a commitment that has already been agreed. But we also have to remember our side as developing countries, that we cannot act only if we get the resources. This is a very big difference thing. And so when you see the list that was mentioned by Ms. Sharma, or if you see the list of what so many developing countries like Indonesia or Brazil is doing, it is also our commitment that we're going to act independently of that. There is no doubt that additional resources would help enormously. And in cases like, for instance, when you're going to invest in energy, what you're going to do now, if you start to promote, for instance, thermoelectric of coal today, this means that you're going to have it for 40 years. So what is the difference between starting now a coal thermoelectric or having the different resources to choose another option? And this, I believe, is something that there are many studies about it, and this is another reason for optimism, is that there is enough knowledge today, there are enough information today for countries to have better decisions about their long-term commitments. I believe also that developing countries have understood in this negotiation that there is a dimension that is really central, which is to participate in those negotiations and to commit to results and to support other developing countries. So countries like India, like Brazil, like Indonesia, we are in the G20. We are able to support other countries in many, many project. So I think this is we have to look at it as a cooperative operation and not as a constant bickering. And I think that Ina mentioned a very nice sentence from her president on how constructive we have to need to be. If we want, we can disagree on everything, as Alex said. We can disagree and we can stop everything. We have to absolutely try to find solutions, and your generation will certainly do a better job than mine.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We will have time to discuss more face-to-face with some of the panelists, and now I'd like to turn back to IGSD to close our session.
Thank you so much. And I will pass off to Ms. Zarin Osho, who is the director of IGSD's India program, to deliver final remarks. Ms. Osho is an international climate law and policy expert, pardon me, and she'll be closing our session this evening. Zarin?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of TERI and IGSD, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for being with us this evening to discuss the role of global collective action to address climate change. Every day, we hear terrifying stories about how climate change is on a fast track past the 1.5 degrees safe guardrail. We have heard from our distinguished panelists how each of their countries is transforming the world, bending the emissions curve, and building resilience to address climate change. We are in a race against time. Time, temperature, tipping points. It's getting too hot, and we have left ourselves with too little time to hit the brakes before we skid out of control. Countries have long recognized the need for collective action to address the climate crisis. The G20 offers a rare opportunity to accelerate true action and to truly personify the mantra of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. As a token of our gratitude, we present to our distinguished guests the symbol of green future for all. I request Dr. Vibha Dhawan to please present saplings from IGSD and TERI to all of our panelists. Thank you. वो निकल गए group photograph, group photograph, group photograph.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists, to all of our guests for joining us this evening. We invite you to join us in the bar area to my right for drinks and dinner as well. Panelists, if you wouldn't mind standing up, we'll do one group photo before drinks and dinner. Thank you so much.